Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. As you know, you saw from our earlier email that Danielle has had to step aside because she's moved. So you know that, and I don't know where Joanna is, our vice chair. So if you're okay with me starting things off, are people okay with that? Okay, and hopefully Joanna will be here soon. I'm sure she's probably caught
So is it okay that
and coming.
these are here?
Yeah, and let's. We have Andrea. Yes, we have quorum. Right, we have our members at large, and yeah, we're good in terms of our numbers. Yeah, thanks for checking. So we know we've heard from Diane Van Bosch isn't able to be here tonight, nor is Judy Shields from Voice. Welcome, Deirdre. So anyone else that's not here, I'm not sure. So, Mike has said, stuck at work. Okay.
Not coming at all?
Right, not coming. Yeah. So regrets for Mike. And did we have someone say they were going to be late? No? Okay. Okay, so if you don't mind, I'll start things, and then when we get to election of the chair, then that person will take over. Is that okay? So I've done our welcome and call to order. We need approval of the agenda. Margot approve, seconded by Lou. Any comments on the agenda? No. Looking for approval of the agenda. All in favor? Great. Thank you. Agenda is approved. The minutes from June 4th. I need someone to move those, please. Approval of the minutes from June 4th. Lou is moving. Someone to second, please. Sophia, thank you. Any comments, questions about the June 4th minutes? None. Looking for approval of the June 4th minutes. Those in favor? Great, thank you. And they're approved. So we put this in order of doing the Spec Ed review first because we have Alana Gray, our external reviewer, here to do a presentation and to be involved in the questions and discussions with us. So that's why we had this first as opposed to doing the chair election. Are people okay with that? Just that way Alana can move on with her night. We're not keeping her waiting. Okay, great, thank you. So we'll switch to her. She has a presentation for us. Thanks, Kevin. Those of you that don't know Kevin in the back, welcome back, Kevin. We used to, we probably were familiar with Summer Sweetman, who was here for the last while. Kevin's come back because he was with us before. And what's the program you went and did? You did a Master of Arts and Media. We gave him a leave, I guess, to go and do some more education, which we're all about. And we're thrilled to have him back. So welcome back, Kevin. Little background then on the Spec Ed review. We started this 3 years ago and came out of a response to concerns that came forward through Siak and through trustee discussions as well around some really difficult decisions we had to make with some budget cuts 3 years ago. And so through those discussions was a recommendation that we should do a review of our programs and services in special education. And so we started that 3 years ago, which we thought was going to be 1 year at that point, and here we are 3 years later. So, and got to appreciate in that first year that the idea was fine to say, let's do a review of our programs and services, until we actually then engaged in that process and worked with two gentlemen who were our first reviewers for that first phase that helped us appreciate you can't say let's go and review all of our programs and services, because that was just a massive and daunting affair. So that helped us really, as we've gone along in this review, get narrower and narrower so we can really dig into whichever area or focus that we have. So when you look at the review and you might say, how come you didn't look at this and this and this? Because there's just so much. So we started very broad in phase one. That really gave us sort of a grounding of information, some of which we've been referring back to and you've asked for more information on, et cetera. So we're very broad and kind of got a baseline in phase one, and then we got a bit narrower and deeper in phase two. And then in phase three, we were very specific in what Alana is going to share tonight. So we had phase one with our two gentlemen, and then Alana's been with us for phases 2 and 3, so she's got a pretty good handle on where we've been and where we've landed now. And so I say external because Alana's not a staff member. We have her on contract. She has great experience in doing a number of different types of reviews and review work. She's also worked very specifically with Appeal Board with a real focus on special education and some of the review work she's done there. So she's come to us with lots of experience in helping us with this work. So I think I've said enough, and I'll let Alana go ahead with her presentation. You know, you got to hit the button on the mic, take the light on. There you go.
Got it. Thank you.
Way you go.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, just seeing here. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction and a little bit of background. So we're in phase 3, year 3. And I'd like to start by thanking the members of the steering committee first and foremost for their direction and support throughout the process, throughout the entire 3 years. These folks are clearly very committed. It's been 3 years in the making and many conversations, lots of strategizing, and many pages and pages of gifts from me to them at every meeting. I just kept throwing it on their plate, and they constantly returned to the next meeting with smiles and wanting more. So thank you very much for your patience and for your support. So here we are in phase 3. We definitely made it through, as Mark had mentioned, we started broad and we really focused on, as the questions were asked at every phase, we identified what those questions were in terms of priorities and then dug deeper. And that's exactly what we've done for phase 3. The intention of this phase was to build on the findings from phase 1 and 2 with a focus on examining the strengths, challenges, and best practices of assessment and identification for learning disabilities and giftedness. This phase involved a deeper dive into the research literature and the professional theories that were out there with respect to the 2 exceptionalities, trends in the student and enrollment achievement in the board, and we also looked at the parent perceptions of the program and their child's improvement, and that was taken from phase 1. So to guide the intent overall for phase 3 was to guide future decisions with respect to elementary assessment, identification, programming, and support for these elementary students. So first step involved reviewing available research literature around the assessment, identification, and programming for the young students with LD or at risk for LD and giftedness. So first and foremost, much of the literature focused on child development considerations and had a strong influence of both developmental variables as well as environmental variables where the functioning of young children is concerned. So this also had an impact on, obviously, assessment and identification when you're thinking of the different domains of a given child who is in the midst of development. They had the literature indicated various strengths of assessment, one of which being nomination and screening, which can cast a wide net for identifying students. It maximizes the fairness of the assessments and the diversity. So we get a range of students with a variety of diverse backgrounds. The quantitative and authentic approaches together will capture various domains as well in terms of aptitude, strengths, weaknesses, abilities, and skills that students have. The cognitive measures in assessments offer an objective and systematic assessment of verbal and nonverbal reasoning skills. Assessment challenges identified through the literature was 4 in particular. Standardized assessment results are typically less accurate, valid, and reliable, particularly among the young children. The literature would say that the stability of assessment results among young children is variable, particularly when measuring cognitive development. The relationship between early test scores and future development, meaning predictive validity of these assessments, is unclear as well. And the older the child is, in terms of another assessment challenge, the older the child is when the initial assessment occurs, the stronger the relationship is with IQ. So in terms of student enrollment, we did look at both elementary and secondary for both kids that are in the learning disabilities program as well as those in the gifted program. And over 5 years with those with the learning disabilities, we found that enrollment with students identified with learning disabilities decreased by 42% on average. It's a gradual decline that we can see both in elementary and secondary. And we can see higher numbers or higher enrollment in secondary. The decrease in enrollment is slightly more among females and students in the East and the West.
Alana, can I just clarify that those aren't just students in self-contained placements? They're
That's right.
all students identified.
That we're looking at now, and we'll dig a little bit deeper in just a minute. So for students, in terms of student enrollment in the actual primary, intermediate, and junior levels, we can see that overall, actually, let me back up a little bit. Overall, of all of elementary, we did have an increase in 27% for gifted students. And over the 7 years of enrollment, the students identified as gifted decreased almost 50% in primary and increased in junior and intermediate divisions. So you can see that in that chart there. And then within primary, the chart to the left, to the right, we see a decrease of 70% in grade 1 and about 40% in grades 2 and 3.
So my question is really as far as the identification of children who have been identified as gifted. My understanding is that there is teacher nomination in kindergarten, and then the next formal testing isn't until grade 4. So how would that impact these results as far as the testing times?
So we have up to grade 3 here, and then grade 4 we can see in the intermediate and the junior, we have an increase. So the testing.
Right, so is that due to being identified by the school board, or that is, like, what I'm confused about is if there is no actual testing between grade 1 and 3, there's no testing from the school, how are you increasing or decreasing during that time as far as enrollment?
Mark, did you want to address that?
Sure. So for, you mentioned the nomination process that happens in primary.
Kindergarten.
Well, it starts in SK. It can happen at any time in their primary years, but it starts in SK, right, to clarify. So you have students nominated during that time, and so that's what's happening in the primary years. And so why that number is decreasing, I don't think we dug into to deeply say whether or not it's the number who are meet the criteria as opposed to the number that choose to become identified. Because,
So this is identified by an IPRC versus
correct, this is not,
tested by the school, but choosing not to go through the IPRC. So those children are not included in this. So children who have passed, so the grade 4 testing, once you have your child tested, you then have the option to be formally identified or not, right? And so again,
but same in primary.
Right, okay, but what I'm asking is, so in the last meeting that we had, there was that confusion about if you wanted to be formally identified by the IPRC, you then were choosing to go to a self-contained classroom.
No, you don't have to.
But because this was the whole thing about the touring of the schools. I think it was Deidre that brought it up, that you couldn't tour a school unless you were choosing to send your child there by being formally identified, right?
Correct. You could still change your mind at any time, but
Being identified, it's just whether or not they decide to go to a self-contained program or not.
yeah.
So what may not be happening is that they're not being formally identified. Formally identified, or put forth to be identified.
Or they are choosing to choose, because there's a difference between your choice to become identified and then the placement, right?
Yep.
So they could be choosing to become identified, but not go in a self-contained placement.
Okay.
Which isn't reflected here, right? This is all students whose parents have chosen for them to be identified.
By an
Right.
IPRC.
That's the only way you can be identified. Yeah.
But also children who are being put forth by teachers who are recommending that they have the identification or go through the testing.
Right, but just because you're tested,
Yes,
you're not formally identified.
but also you have to be flagged by, yes, that's right. But also you have to be flagged by a teacher, I think goes forth as well for the LD. That was going to be my question, was where we're seeing these numbers drop, are these children that are being, in some cases, they aren't also being identified by the teachers in the classroom. We know that teachers are overwhelmed by many children in their classrooms, especially at these early years with JKSK classrooms with high populations. So we have perhaps so many things happening in the classroom at one time. Is it possible, are these kids maybe not being identified, perhaps with LD or with gifted, and being put forth for these testing, either because the teacher doesn't have the time to sit and notice certain qualities within these children that maybe need more attention one way or another? Is that a possibility? Or are these children that are being tested and are not being identified with either LD or as gifted, and not just about parents deciding to be identifying in one way or another?
So I don't think we've included a slide, have we, about the non-identified students with an IP? Have we included that slide?
No,
Okay.
we did not.
So I don't think with this current Siak, by that I mean you as a committee, we have necessarily discussed this. We have, because of the results that came forward in the first couple phases of the review, really spent time focused in on there's a growing number of students, because you see these declines. There's another graph here of a rising number of students who have an IEP, and so if they have an IEP, that's because there has been, that the needs of those students have been noticed, if that's, to use that same language, and brought forward by staff, should be in collaboration with parents, and through that process of problem solving, which we ask that all families and schools do, that they've come forward and said this child does have some special needs and therefore needs an IEP developed and put in place, and strategies and resources, etc. And And through that process, depending on the child, there may be the option to identify or not, depending on the profile and if there's been assessments, et cetera. So in Halton, but province-wide, all boards are seeing a rise in that number of students who have an IEP but are not formally identified. So within that grouping, I think there's, and we've talked about here that we would like to dig into to understand more who's in that group, because we are seeing some declines like this for some exceptionalities. And I want to clarify that a student with an IEP that's not identified is afforded all the same supports that a student who has an IEP that is identified. So I don't want it to be construed that they're not getting the services that they should get, right? Whatever the profile of that student, the choice of that family to not identify doesn't mean that the student can't get, accommodations and appropriate strategies provided for them to be supported in the classroom. So, but there is that change that's happening. And like I said, it's province-wide and it's been going on for years. We've tracked the data. I've seen ministry data over 15 or 20 years that show that line just continuing to climb all across the province. I think it's for a variety of reasons, but I guess it's speculation on my part as opposed to us really digging in and understanding why is that number growing. So I'm saying all that to respond to questions you're raising about where are these kids going. There may be some families who are choosing not to identify and not have an IEP. That's possible too. But we're certainly seeing a rise in students with an IEP who are non-identified.
Sorry, Al, can I just a quick clarification then. So are these including children who have an IEP that have been tested but are not formally identified by an RPRC?
No.
Okay.
Christina? Yeah. So.
Yeah, just on behalf of the Learning Disabilities Association, I think from our perspective, while I understand that those are the numbers, I think they're misleading in that the number of students with learning disabilities is not going down, as I'm sure that the number with gifted children is not changing dramatically. We as an organisation are extremely concerned about the high increase in the number of unidentified children, not because it changes necessarily the programming, but because it changes the data with which we as a group make decisions. And I think that's to the detriment of accessing resources. I think it's to the detriment of us being able to define the correct programming. And I think that one of the things that our organization would push for is a way of tracking the data as to whether a child has had some kind of assessment that determines a learning disability or giftedness, rather than necessarily waiting for the decision of the IPRC, which to a certain extent is purely about placement. And I think the data that we need relates to what are the diagnoses that we're serving rather than where have we put the children. So that would be my comment.
If I could respond to that. So in our staff in our department, we have the same desire for more accurate data. And so we've talked about that. We're looking at the information that's captured within our special education engine. That's our program that collects all our documentation and what's able to be tracked and shown on a student's IEP. One of the challenges of that is that is personal information about that child, whether they've had an assessment or not, whether they have a diagnosis, whether they meet the criteria for identification, whether they choose to identify or not, but whether they meet the criteria. All of that is personal information about that child that parents would have to choose to say, sure, you can include that in your documentation, in your records data gathering. So it would still be, I guess, so the data wouldn't necessarily be a true reflection. It might be more accurate, but it may not be complete because we can't collect and record and report that data without consent.
But surely in the case of EQAO, we collect data about the results of children without necessarily having their specific approval, because we collect it in an unidentifiable way. Surely if we as an organization could collect that data where we don't identify the child, but use that data in terms of a pooling to provide us with information, that would overcome those privacy challenges. I would put it to the group.
That's a good thought. We'll have to think about that further, about how that would work. Certainly it would have, without the parents' consent, it would have to be anonymized. So yeah, it's work that we're talking about and trying to figure out how to dig into this to get more accurate data, because we want that as well.
I'm wondering if one of the reasons that the numbers may be going down in the chart here is if there's a dual diagnosis and say they have ADHD and a learning disability, maybe the ADHD becomes the primary focus, whereas previously it was the LD. Could that skew the numbers? That makes sense.
It does somewhat, because our system only, shows in terms of this data collection the primary, whatever has been chosen to be the the most pressing need to show, right? And so but we have looked at that. So I'll say it'll change the numbers a little bit. So it could go one way or the other, right, depending on which one is at the primary. But we've also looked, and there are, as a percentage, we have, what's our number at now? Maybe close to 12,000 students with over 11,000 students with an IEP. The number with a dual diagnosis is very small. So, yeah, it wouldn't be that many, to make a significant difference. Any other questions before we go on? Christina?
I have a question and maybe a point of clarification. So I'm just thinking about data collection, and if we're able to really dig into the reasons behind the apparently decreasing numbers. One of the data points that I don't know if we collect is when a parent is going to a school and saying, I suspect there might be something with my child, could you test them? But it doesn't necessarily result in a formal IEP, or it doesn't go to IPRC. I wonder if that's worth digging into, because sometimes it doesn't get off the ground, or maybe looking at the time frame between when the parent approaches and when they're able to be identified. I think that would be significant for parents to know how quickly they can expect realistically with the resources available for that to move along. And then the other one was a question, if you can clarify. So you mentioned that students with an IEP but not identified formally through IPRC, they're receiving the same opportunities. So what is the advantage of the IPRC identification? That's my question.
Sure. So to your first question, that problem-solving process sometimes takes some time in terms of the dialogue between the school and the home, and also the needs of the child and how that shows itself in the classroom, right? Sometimes it can happen very quickly because things are maybe more clear or more urgent, and sometimes they can take quite a while. as Alana was saying earlier, in terms of the literature review, we don't do some assessments until the children reach a certain age, knowing that they won't be very valid, right? And we have to be good stewards of our resources in terms of when we do those assessments. So, and then we do have students for whom we do assessments, and the results aren't such that the students would then meet the criteria for a certain identification. So you have a group of students for whom you might say there are certainly needs there, yet they're not specific enough to meet the definitions set by the ministry and the board for those exceptionalities. So that's, I guess to be clear, there are some pieces of data that we gather and some that we don't. So the review has been limited by what we gather, right? That's been clear, and so therefore some of the data that we're presenting, I guess it's helpful to be clear on what it's saying in terms of, something like the title here. These are students with a gifted exceptionality, right? That's very specifically that. It's not how many were tested or not, or how many parents chose to identify or not. There's a whole another sort of surrounding pieces of data around this. This is specifically what you see on screen there, just like the slide before with LD, right? Very specifically, those kids who met the criteria and parents chose to identify. So, and then for your second question, so the choice to identify, I think as the point was made earlier, was about the placement options. So we have, we have the options, the same options that the ministry says the boards must provide, one of which is resource support with consultative support, which is where the self-contained teacher, the CERT is supporting the educational staff around how best to program. Then there's resource support with I forget the right language here, Sean, we don't call it withdrawal, we call it resource support with, is it just called withdrawal? I'm complicating things, yeah. So where they'll get some amount of withdrawal support from the class. Could be in a small group, could be individually, but it's support from a special education teacher. That's part of the expectation from the ministry. And then a third placement option is a self-contained placement. And so that's a small class setting where the students have to spend at least 50% of their week, their time in that class. Depending on the class, there may be integration options. It depends on the student's readiness and options for that. So those are the three options that are available. The first two, the resource support, can look similar to what a student would get whether they chose to be identified or not. It's the self-contained placement where you need to choose that. You have to choose to be identified in order to access the self-contained placement. Does that make sense? So, the resource support and what that looks like in the school really doesn't look much different. So then you have families that are choosing either way, and the reasons for that, I think we can speculate on what those might be, but that's maybe an area that we want to dig into, is to understand why is that students with an IEP that are non-identified, why is that number climbing, and why are these other numbers dropping?
One more. Is there any impact to the funding that's received by the board if people choose to go IPRC or not?
Great question. No, there isn't. So we get the same dollars, and as a school board, we don't differentiate in our decisions around resources whether or not the child is identified or not. We look at the number of students with an IEP in that school and all the other needs within that school to make those decisions. So schools don't get if you want to call it, penalized for having fewer children identified, nor do they benefit if they have more identified, right? Because we don't want anyone playing any games around that side of things, whether they be parents or staff or whatever else. It doesn't matter. You have an IEP, we provide resources appropriately to those schools. Thanks, Lou.
Sorry, can I, but I think that comes to the key point there, is that because there is no benefit to anybody other than accessing a self-contained classroom for which there are relatively few places and it's only for a specific small group of children, that is why the numbers are going down, because in interactions with school staff, the number of times that I've been told that there is no point in going to IPRC because I get exactly the same services, if every parent is getting that message, those numbers will go down until the only children that are identified are the ones that have to or need to have access to the self-contained classroom. And at that point in time, we will have lost all of our data.
I think because we're really talking about data here, right? Again, I'll say I hope people are clear. We're not talking about service. So I don't want people thinking, being concerned about, we're not providing the same, level of service. So I agree, it is about the data, and that does make it more challenging to not truly know we know the profiles of our kids individually, right? That's well known at the school, by the teacher. It's the collective big picture that isn't coming through as, and to be clear, this was changed by the ministry a number of years ago because there were many boards that said you can't get this service without identifying your child, right? And then the ministry said, this is going back a ways, so I can't remember if the ministry articulated that as well. But there was the ministry changed that just because there were numbers of families that said, I don't want my child labeled, right? I don't want that stigma, whether it was real or perceived, they didn't want that. And so there were families, and cultural reasons and other things as well, there were families who were saying, okay, I'm not going to identify my child, and therefore not getting any service, right? So when the ministry changed that and said, no, those access to resources and accommodations, et cetera, in the classroom, you don't have to identify to access those, right? That was really about access that change was made. So I don't want you to think it's all negative that right? I think there's probably more kids getting more service because they don't have to be identified. Deirdre. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm going to apologize to you first because I realize we're kind of taking over here. This is obviously a very hot topic for us. I'm going to, it's very much about the service. As much as it is about the data, we are using the data to structure the service. So the data is the key point in all of this. If we do not have the data and we don't know who we're defining within the system, we cannot structure the services we need to supply these students. Because as the data disappears for us, as we just IEP blanket everybody and take away the self-contains or the certs or however we start to kind of filter out our special education program for these students, it just all becomes IEP blanketed rather than being specialized for each individual exceptionality for the children. So the data is the core of how it's what we're talking about tonight. It's what our study's all about. Our data is important because it is our services, I think personally.
Can I just sort of ask that might help with you? Is a question about the data, because you're talking only about identified. So now when we have a child who has been recognized by a teacher or a parent as having either a learning disability or being tested and being identified informally as gifted, what is the board's recommendation to the parents? Do they suggest for them to be formally identified, or do they say an IPRC or an IEP is good? So you don't need an IPRC unless you want to go into self-contained placement. Because if we're looking at data and we're only looking at the formally identified, as a board, what is our messaging to parents when their child gets the unofficial identification?
So it should be the same for all exceptionalities, all profiles of students, that if a child meets the criteria for identification in that exceptionality, that the options are shared with parents. So
no, but what I'm asking is if they have reached those, like the targets. So they've been. I'm going to use gifted because I know that there's a grade 4 tested for giftedness.
I get it.
So if they pass those tests and they have been informally identified, are parents encouraged for formal identification, or they're said you don't need a formal identification unless you want to put them into self-contained classrooms?
They should be neither. It should be, here are your options. You can choose not to identify at all. You can choose to identify, and here are your placement options. So all of those options should be there for parents, and for parents to be well informed of what those options will mean for their child. So it's not it's not staff's job to say go this way or that way.
I recognize, but I'm just kind of thinking about the idea that you're saying this is about the data, right? So,
Yeah.
But if we don't have the data, because we are going along the path of having children having non-identified learning disabilities or non-identified giftedness, how can we paint a true picture of what's occurring in our classrooms? So in that, are we not wanting to have the data for us to analyze, which we won't have if they're all going as non-identified exceptionalities?
Well, or it begs the question: how else can we gather data about our kids, right? That what else? You're making some suggestions, Alison. What else can we gather? Because we don't want to go back to where we were before, where families said, "Okay, I have to identify. I feel I'm forced into this, even though it's not what I want for my child." So we still want parents to have those options, and we want a better picture, a collective picture of who our kids are. I struggle, Deirdre, with your comment that. No, I'm going back to Deirdre. Sorry. Yeah, I struggle with your assertion that kids don't get service if they don't get identified, because that might look like that in terms of the data, but I think we could turn to the stories of individual students that aren't shown in the data and say how we're meeting the needs of all kinds of students with all kinds of needs that aren't identified. That's happening every day in every school.
Yes, I'm obviously not going to discredit all the good things that are happening within the system. Of course, there are wonderful things happening with the students that are not formally identified every day. But there are also many children that are falling through the cracks that we are not servicing. And when we look at the data that we see in front of us here that says that 42% of LD students, that there's a drop over the last 7 years, or that there is a 50% decrease of giftedness over the last 7 years. How is that a true possible statement for us to say that those are true numbers? It just does not seem to be a reasonable thing. And then we say, okay, well, it's just data and it's not the services, but it's part of this report. that we're looking at to talk about budgetary changes to our special education programming to service these same students. So if we are basing some of our advice on servicing our groups here that we all sit and represent for our students, and we look at these numbers, then we're talking about basing some of our our advice on these numbers. It has to be about the data so that we can kind of curtail the service to match. And this isn't what we would say looks true to our numbers. So
yeah, that's a fair comment. Our budget decisions haven't been driven by these. I'll say that, right? So, and our decisions about individual students hasn't been driven by this. So, we certainly are looking at this data, and it's not driving our decisions per se in terms of programs and services. It's really what it's doing for us is raising more questions. It's certainly begging us to look at how well staff are prepared in their knowledge and their skills, their training, to meet the needs of a wide range of kids in our classes, because for the vast majority of kids and families, that's where they want to be, right? They want to be in a regular class with their peers in their home school. They don't have to go somewhere else. They want to be with their neighbors, going to school and be a regular kid, if I can frame it that way. So, and we're seeing a rise in the number of kids for whom that choice is made, and also who are being successful that way. As we look at our data, if I look forward into high school, for example, in our programs that we offer, alternative ed, those numbers have been declining for a number of years now, because we're doing a better and better job of meeting the range of student needs in the regular class. So I think it's a real testament to the growing skill of our teachers. Is it a challenge? Sure it is. Is it demanding on staff? Sure it is. Is it ultimately better for kids? I would argue that it is. So this is a complex issue, right? A complex thing that I think it's good for us to dig into as Siak. You're raising some good questions for staff to consider. This is the meaty stuff that honestly I think we should be digging into as Siak. It's challenging work. So Joanna, thanks for, I'm sure you're running from somewhere.
Hijacked it.
So I sort of started chairing, and then I moved over here because of Alana's presentation. So now that you're here, thank you, because you're going to hand you the gavel as vice chair. So, so we've been digging into questions. Do we want to keep going with the questions, or do we want to let Alana finish her presentation? Where do we want to go? How about we'll let her keep going? Is that okay? And Joanna, we'll let you chair.
All right. My apologies. Okay, Lucille. Lucille. Can we just, is this? No.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, as someone that was part of the previous Siak, I just want to give some perspective, is that some of what we are discussing is what we were worrying previously, and as confusing as it might be, we are in the right direction, because this information, I feel, as Mark does, is what we need, and we need to understand it, because with us looking at it, I am quite sure the school board, in their way, is as interested as this information as well. So that I think we should continue to listen to what is being said and to what has been uncovered.
Great, okay. Thank you for that. So we'll continue, Alana.
So part of the achievement data that we collected, we looked at for the gifted students, we looked at how they were achieving in both placements. So the phase 2 indicated that the gifted students are all, 99% of them are achieving very well in EQA assessments. So then we dug deeper and said, what does that look like in terms of level 3 and 4 for the gifted? And we're finding, and what we found over 4 years of that trend data is that the achievement is equal with respect to EQAO results for those students that are in resource support and self-contained placements. And in some years, that achievement was better with kids in resource support versus the self-contained placements. Then looking again at that parent perceptual piece through the survey that we had administered in phase 1, we found that the parents felt that their children were doing better if they were in the self-contained. Those parents of the self-contained students, they thought that they were doing better. So it's kind of a different scenario here. The students are actually achieving better in resource, but those self-contained parents are saying that they find that their children are achieving better, both academically and with various skills. And with learning disabilities, the student achievement is higher in resource support, while parent perception is that it's better in self-contained.
Can you clarify, when you're saying achievement, are you talking about academic, and is it possible that the parents are looking at more than academic, like social and soft skills?
So we did ask specifics. We asked academic, socially, reading, writing, math was the academic, socially, behaviorally, whether they found that they were improving, and if so, to what extent?
The details of those questions we sent out, not with the agenda, but the last week's email. I know there were a lot of attachments in there, but in there were the specific parent surveys and student surveys were included there. So if you want to see the kinds of questions that were asked, they're in those. I know there's a lot of attachments a week ago, but they're in there.
I should also just make a note that achievement for both self-contained and regular class, the expectation is just to meet grade level requirements curriculum-wise. So both self-contained classes versus pullouts, achievement is expected to just meet grade level norms on both cases, correct?
For EQAO, the achievement that we report is meeting the ministry standard.
Margot. Mine's a quick question. So I know this is quantitative as far as the numbers, but did we look at the reasoning behind that at all? Did you look at why? Like, is it, I know that they feel that they do better in self-contained classrooms. Is it due to better communication between parents, or is it due to their perception that the teacher is better equipped to deal with students with exceptionality? Do we know the why? I'm going to say the why's behind the what. Do we know that?
So as part of that survey, we did ask open-ended questions if they wanted to identify any strengths or challenges or anything else. And they did provide, some parents provided some detailed feedback as to why they felt that the self-contained, their child in self-contained was achieving or not achieving in those particular areas.
Were there any trending themes?
No, because the question itself is quite open-ended. What are your strengths, or what do you feel the strengths and the challenges are? And if you receive, 700 responses, they could be anywhere over the map in terms of their own experiences. So we didn't find any specific trends in terms of achievement and their perceptions of them.
Mark would like to vote.
Alana, you conducted some focus groups with groups of parents, right?
Yes.
Did any, in response to that question, did anything come out in those focus groups?
So yes, the parents, some of those parents that have children in the self-contained gifted classes would say that behaviorally and socially it was much better for their child because they were with like-minded peers. I mean, it's not necessarily something that we haven't heard or don't know, but a few of those parents would say that. And then other parents that have their children in the resource support classes said that they were completely satisfied with what was happening in the class, and their child was completely happy, and they weren't interested in switching them over because those skills and those academic outcomes were fine for them.
The thing that, I've read through both of the reports, and the thing that I took clearly as relates to that finding in terms of parent perception is the finding that I think it's both true for both the gifted and the LD students is that the perception of parents in the self-contained placement was that their child's assessment or evaluation process, IEP development, use of their child's IEP was stronger in the self-contained classroom than it was in the regular classroom. And I think part of it is the fact that in the regular system, and it's certainly a comment we hear from parents, is that they don't necessarily trust that the IEP is being implemented, whereas in a self-contained classroom, they know it's going to be implemented, and that's why their perception is that the child is doing better regardless of what the results are, in my opinion.
Hey, Mark.
I think also, if I recall correctly, the data also says that parents' experiences around communication with the teacher or educator team is better in a self-contained setting. So whether that's because of class size or focus or whichever, but which may add to the perception anyway of achievement being better, right? And support and integration, all those kinds of things.
Okay, so with key considerations were based on the data that we collected through the literature review and the parent feedback, the achievement, and the enrollment information. So kind of all over the phases, we pulled those considerations that we thought were important to think about when planning and going forward. So we see some of those considerations indicating with respect to screening and assessment issues in the literature. We have low stability and unclear predictability, which was reviewed earlier, of those assessment results for the young kids. The optimal age for non-categorical screening, they're suggesting between kindergarten and grade 1. And for assessment for LD, they're suggesting between grades 3 and 4, something to consider there. The emphasis on early recognition and timely identification and intervention was definitely throughout both exceptionalities, and comprehensive multi-dimensional assessment approaches. So not just at one point in time, we need lots of data from different people in various environments, etc. Okay. And then with enrollment and achievement with respect to gifted, the considerations that we pulled as being quite important was the fact that we have declining numbers of students identified in the primary years. We have low success rates with primary screening. That success rate was 36%. After being nominated, the child then goes through for their screening process, and 36% are successfully meet that criteria. And then we have high achievement regardless of placement, which is what we saw through digging deeper into that EQAO data.
I just have a question regarding that. I had asked previously or early on, there was some information regarding when the gifted program was first reiterated or put into place here in Halton. And there was information regarding students that were put forth for the gifted screening and testing. And we could see all the numbers. And we could see how it had changed over the years, the nominations, and the percentage of children that were put forth and how many were tested and how many came through the testing. And do you have data on how many children are put forth today versus, say, 7 years ago for the testing on a yearly basis? How many children are actually nominated versus now versus then?
So maybe I'll answer that. So we have been gathering that. because that was when we first started the primary self-contained placement, where this was part of that process. That was the question, was how successful was that process? So we tracked that right from the first year. So we've continued to gather that data, and that's how Alana knows that number of 36 or 37% success rate. Yeah. So we can, in a future meeting, we can bring a fuller, sort of a year by year, and share that with you.
Yeah, I'm interested. I had asked actually previously for that information because I'm curious to know. I realized that there's a 37% success rate, but I'm curious to know how the numbers have changed over the years. So although the success rate may stay the same at 37%, it's 37% of how many children that are being put forth is my question. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, it wasn't part of the review, but we'll bring it.
Okay, and with additional key considerations that we thought,
Sorry. Just had a question, if we can go back, the previous screen. The first two questions, it was the question where it or the statement where it stopped about that one, the low stability and unclear predictable validity of the assessment results in younger children. So is that considered JK and SK versus the K to grade 1, or when do we start to think that the results are more valid in the assessment?
So the literature was very clear with respect to the optimal age. So they're suggesting highly that screening occurs in grades kindergarten through grade 1 and be non-categorical in nature, so non-diagnostic. We are going to screen, we are going to identify that there's this student is at risk. Work with that student in terms of interventions and instruction. And then if that student is not responding over the course of increased through the tiers of intervention, then the assessment, formal assessment in grade 3 and 4 is what the literature is suggesting, recommending.
So is that only for learning versus giftedness? And my second part of that question is, what if someone falls through the cracks? So what if that isn't assessed and now we're past, say, even grade 3 going into 4 and there's still no assessment?
Yes. So question number 1 regarding giftedness, that is a mixed bag of results or suggestions and recommendations from those professional experts in the gifted field. Much of the literature that I've read indicates that age 8 is what they call the sweet spot for gifted identification. It's anywhere from grade age 6 to 8, 6 to 9, not after age 9, depending on who you speak to and who you're reading at the time. So falling through the cracks, we actually did not go deep into that literature. So I wouldn't be able to respond to that in terms of what the research is saying.
So I'm just thinking about the falling through the cracks thing, and I think this is where I circle back to. I think we need to somehow be capturing parents who are coming forward saying, my child wasn't brought forward for identification, but I'm pretty sure they need some sort of assessment. And the school is saying, well, we'll just wait and see, or we don't have the resources or whatever. And then those kids are not being identified until much, much later, maybe even as late as grade 8. So there's a piece of data there to be captured to inform us about how many kids really are falling through the cracks.
So maybe if I could respond to that. So our practices around when we do a formal assessment, and by that I mean a psychological assessment, aligns with this. Because when we've made our decisions years ago around when best to do that, it's aligned with much of the literature that Alana has reviewed. Some of that research is I don't know if I want to use the word date, it's older, but you've looked at lots of very current research as well, right? And so that's why we do our assessments of psychological assessments for most children around that grade 2, 3, 4 age, because we know, especially grades 3, 4, that's when we're going to get the most validity. And so I appreciate that for some students, parents want that sooner. And once again, we as a board have to be good stewards of our resources. So if we said every time a parent, if we did all the assessments that parents asked for, we'd be spending millions more on assessments. I can tell you that right now, because lots of parents make that request. It doesn't mean that request is well guided, I guess. That's the right decision for the child at that time. So, but it also doesn't mean that we don't do anything, right? There are a number of other assessments that teachers do, academic assessments, to determine the kinds of needs that children are presenting. CERTs also do assessments, and we make programming and resource decisions around those. So to say that we're not going to do a formal assessment until grade 3 doesn't mean we're not doing anything. Lots of things that help us understand the profile of that student and help us program for that student are occurring as early as JK. So we're doing those things during those years. But we're not doing an assessment every time a parent comes and asks. It doesn't mean parents don't know their children. It doesn't mean that they're not right in terms of raising the flag, in terms of there's a concern here. But it doesn't mean that we should be doing an assessment every time they're asking.
Sorry, yeah, and I'd like to sort of reinforce what Mark is saying there, is that from the perspective of the Learning Disabilities Association, having the data is clear. Around about grade 3 is when you get a clear diagnosis. But I think as a board, it's again critical that we're doing the early intervention and we're capturing the data on those children that have been deemed to be at risk of an LD, so that we're capturing that earlier on, way before they get to the point of an assessment and ever being captured in these numbers, so that we have an idea of the full nature of the children that we're supporting, but also the success we may be making. Because, if we capture them early and we do the early intervention, then we hope that by the time they get to grade 3 and 4, we've put in place the remedial action that prevents them from ever hitting these numbers. So again, it comes down to collecting the data before there's been identification, before there's been an agreement to have a formal process underway. But somehow we need to be capturing that data.
And the literature certainly backs you up on that, saying that the tiered approach to intervention would mean start with those screening pieces very, very early, the reading, the writing, and the language. Working with that data, constantly monitoring over time, seeing if there's, and then increasing that intervention and instruction based on those needs. And if a student is not responding, then let's think of next steps.
So maybe another future topic for one of our meetings would be to dig into what those early assessment and intervention current tools and strategies are to help you better understand, because for a lot of this we're not really talking about kids necessarily before we get to that formal identification stage, right? So we're a number of years into their school career. So I think it might be helpful for you to hear all the things we're doing before then, because there's lots going on.
I just wanted to clarify, just regarding the statement, high achievement regardless of placement for the gifted section there. regarding the social emotional, is that come into play for some of the questions I know that you asked parents for the placements in the classroom that were supported by the CERT and also for the self-contained placements? Obviously, the parents who chose to keep their children within the classroom supported by a CERT and an IEP felt perhaps that their child didn't need to go into a self-contained program to be amongst like-minded peers for a social or emotional experience because their child maybe didn't have that need or requirement. So perhaps the data is a little skewed that way. The child, of course, would be happy with their placement in the homeroom classroom, being supported by their CERT. And then also the children that would be in a classroom amongst like-minded peers are finding, their community there as well. So the statement of high achievement regardless of placement, may it be academic or social emotional, just might, the question could be very open-ended, as you had kind of said before, but also be particular to the child.
Yes, now with that consideration of high achievement regardless of placement, that's based on clear data, EQAO and report card data where academic, when we say achievement, that's what we're referring to there. But certainly parents were asked about above and beyond the achievement that they're perceiving their child as achieving throughout the last year.
So do we have the data as well to kind of, a lot of what is related to the gifted placement as well has a lot to do with the social emotional aspects of the child in their self-contained programming, provided they're amongst like-minded peers versus being in a classroom and being pulled out or provided with a CERT and accommodations within the classroom. Do you have kind of more data regarding the parents? Obviously, it's probably amongst these things as well, but I think it should be part of the summary as well for that kind of programming because it is an important piece of the gifted placement puzzle. Yes,
and in phase 2 and in phase 1, we captured a little bit more of that depth. For phase 3, it was more of what's happening out there in the research literature and then connecting that with some of the achievement and enrollment here. But phase 1 and 2 would have more detail, that qualitative piece that you're talking about.
So, sorry, Joanna. So we did send out phases 1 and 2, and I know, once again, we sent you lots of attachments. So if you can't find it, because what you're asking for, it is in there. We have charts and charts in the first phase of that sort of summarize the parent responses, because we sent out over 10,000 we sent it to every parent of a child with an IEP, and we had a 30% response rate, I think, which is pretty high if you're in the world of data and surveys. You're happy if you get a 10% response. So 30% was a really good response rate, and so there's quite a bit of data there that was considered valid because of the response number, right? If it's too low, then it's not considered valid, but it was a high enough number. There's lots of information there. So if you dig into phases 1 and 2, you'll see more of that.
Lisa, did you have a question? You're good? Okay. We can proceed.
Thank you. Okay, so next in terms of key considerations specific to learning disabilities, we found that parents and staff both indicated through data collection process that they're well aware that no identification is happening in primary, that through the quantitative data, the declining number of students identified in elementary and secondary as the years are going on, and those achievement gaps are continuing over time between those students with a learning disability versus those without an exceptionality. So we see that those achievement gaps, and they're not closing in some respects, in many respects. Okay. Further considerations with respect to parent perceptions, satisfaction and support for self-contained placement definitely is there. through the parent survey that we distributed in phase 1, the reported improvement for self-contained students, more so in their perceptions than those in resource support, inconsistent screening practices among the gifted students. That's what parents had indicated that they had concern about. Lengthy assessment and support wait times for LD, again, from parents reporting through focus groups, they're concerned with that. And then inequities between exceptionalities from both staff and parents. In terms of just staff perceptions, the time and the cost of primary gifted assessments is quite high, and it's time intensive. Enhanced learning needs of primary students, they feel can be addressed in regular classrooms. And thank you. Any more questions?
I just wanted to ask, and maybe this was covered somewhere, when you refer to HDSB staff, who was included in that? Is that classroom teachers, or who is that?
So we had focus groups with several staff, including school administrators, classroom teachers, CERTs, and psychology support staff.
Do we currently know what the wait time is for assessments as of now?
At this very moment, I couldn't tell you. Our expectation is that we keep it to a year or less for psychological assessments and 8 months or less for speech language pathology. So, but it varies through the year, and it varies by school and area. So our managers of professional services monitor those assessments, and they know that, so if they were to check in with me as a psychologist and say, tell me the current wait time for Rolling Meadows just around the corner here, and I might say, okay, I've got a wait list of right now of 9 months. So they would, be aware of that. And they might, so my next school, Brand Hills, they might say, well, it's pushing 14 months is going to be how long it's going to take me to get to, to the last student on the list. And so they're monitoring that constantly. And if a school like one, is reported to be over 12, then our managers then would go and say to our psych staff, say, okay, three of your schools are at 6 months. Can you go and pick up a few assessments over at Branch Hills right now to drop theirs down, right? So that, because you can't control how many students are coming through the school team SRT process. You expect, an average over time to be consistent school to school, but there's ups and downs, right? So our standard is 12 and 8. But like I said, it does fluctuate, and we monitor it to keep it down to those levels.
Yeah, and I would just like to comment that the main issue, there's probably two main issues, but one of the main issues that we hear from our parents is regards to the lengthy assessment and support wait times. I would say that I think the timeline that we have is probably distorted by the fact that a large percentage, if not the majority of parents, seek an assessment elsewhere in the private system, but particularly if the child has an LD, because they cannot afford to wait. And so they will seek that assessment elsewhere and then bring it back to the CERT team. So I think while we may say we can do it in 12 months, if we actually had to do the children that are brought forward or are at risk, we would have significantly longer wait times, and therefore we need to address the support services that are available to our parents. And secondly, and I have a question about the enhanced learning needs, or the staff perception that they can meet the enhanced learning needs of primary students in regular classrooms. I can kind of see that for gifted students, and one of my children is a gifted student. There is a lot to do if we really want to build and make the experience great for them. I have a question. Do the staff, when it comes to LD students who have severe remedial needs regarding reading, writing, maths, really believe that they can address the needs in the regular classroom? And how much support do they feel they need to meet those needs?
So that actually did not come up through the LD focus groups and information sessions that we had with staff. It was more from a gifted perspective that they feel that they can manage those students, their needs in the classroom. But that did not come up specifically for LD.
I'm also curious to know if the same group are testing LD as well as gifted? Is it the same?
When you say the same group, do you mean the same staff?
Yeah.
Yeah. Our psychology staff, if they're doing, if a student requires a psychological assessment, they do a whole range of basically all exceptionalities. So that's why a psychologist would be assigned to a school and do the assessments for that school. So could be gifted, could be LD, could be autism, could be.
So generally speaking, there's a period of time every year in which gifted testing is done at specific schools to enable children to be ready to go into whatever program they're going to do for the following year when it comes to gifted placements. But so the
right, because of the design of the nomination process in the primary grades and the screening that we do in grade 4, those processes require that we have to do assessments for students for potential giftedness on a schedule.
And is the screening that's done for children for the grade 4, is there that doesn't involve having the individualized, that's the second phase of those tests, correct? Like, because they do their standardized testing and then they have a second phase for the gifted requirement.
Yeah, depending on their score.
Right.
Right? If they score high enough on the CCAT 7, I can't remember what the number is, but then there's no need for a psychological assessment at that, because we know statistically if they've scored at that certain level, they're going to hit the 98th percentile. We know that statistically from the results of that test. But then there's a group underneath there that we know statistically may not, therefore we do psychological assessment on them.
But this is where I can see why there's becoming this imbalance that feels like in the system between the gifted and the LD, because we don't have, or the families of gifted don't have the same type of wait times for gifted students as LD does. And this is, I think, where probably staff gets frustrated having students of LD with wait times and support issues, where it seems not the same through the gifted, the way the gifted screening is set up. So I can understand that there's some of this coming through these questionnaires done through staff and then filtering through.
Yeah, and a number of parents are aware of the nomination process in the primary grades for gifted, in that process is designed to have staff, in essence, go looking for kids who are potentially gifted, as opposed to the other exceptionalities where it's more about is that child thriving in the regular class? And if they are, we don't go looking for a child with an LD or with autism or any others, yet the gifted process does ask staff to go looking for kids.
I'm just going to disagree with you on some of that. If you're talking about staff being expected to go looking for children with the exceptionality of giftedness in children is not something that should be necessarily sought out in a child. if a teacher has an opportunity or an educator to sit down with the child and is a part of the everyday interaction with the child, a child with giftedness, it should be able to come through quite clearly enough for a nomination for a gifted assessment. It shouldn't be something that needs to be drawn out or gone sought for.
I would agree with you. It, for a range of reasons, plays out sometimes like that, but also plays out some other ways. So I'm conscious of the time, how much time we want to spend on that tonight, but it philosophically, I would say, once again, the intent is that we meet the needs of our kids in a regular class in their home schools, right? That's where we want to meet the needs of all kids. And if we struggle to do that as a staff, then we dig deeper, right? We engage in that problem-solving process to try to figure out, what can I do as an educator in the class to better program for that child? Are there other resources that we can draw in to help support that child? You know, we try and do all those things first before we finally say, you know what? Maybe, this child is still struggling after all the things we've tried. The child's still having difficulty. Maybe we should consider another placement. That's
yeah. I just hope that that's not the perception as well. This kind of adds to that, that in the balance here where people seem to feel that there's the inconsistencies between giftedness and LD, and where there's a bit of a hierarchy happening. It shouldn't be like that. These children all have exceptionalities. They all should be, cared for and given accommodation. And we'll leave it there.
Well, the perception of parents that there was an inequality there wasn't. This came through in the earlier phases of the study, so it wasn't just between LD and gifted, right? There was all parents of all exceptionalities. Sure, I shouldn't say parents of children of all exceptionalities in those focus groups that reported that.
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent point, Deidre. And we'll take some final questions for Alana, and then we'll move on. So Christina and Allison after. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure if this one's for you, so sorry if I'm keeping you. This is about the wait times. So are those wait times that are goal wait times, or are they the actual wait times? And secondly, with the new budget, there's one full-time psych ed consultant cut and 2 child and youth counselors, and how is that going to impact the wait times?
So the monitoring isn't for the goal, it's the actual wait time, right? So that checking in with the staff is to see constantly what's the current wait time, and to monitor that and adjust our staffing appropriately. The reduction in staff, the CYCs aren't part of those assessments, so doesn't have an impact. With our psychology staff, our decision to reduce 1 is because we are changing our report writing, where we've had quite an open approach to our reports. I would argue that we have some excellent reports being written, but they don't necessarily have to be as extensive as they are. If you're a recipient of one of those reports, they can be pretty long. And we've looked at other boards that have far more compact reports of those results, and many boards follow a much more of a template kind of approach. So we've looked at that and said, as part of that budget process, could we reduce our demands on staff, which would allow us to reduce our staffing allocation? And we said yes, by moving to a template model. So we're doing that this year. So it shouldn't result in a reduction in service and in assessments, just in the time staff spend writing reports.
So Alana, thank you very much for your reports. I mean, obviously it's a huge amount of work that you've done, and thank you to the staff. In terms of what's coming out of this, obviously from the Learning Disabilities Association, we are concerned. We have we have an increasing achievement gap over time. We have lowering numbers of children being identified as having learning disabilities when we know categorically that's not the case. The data clearly shows we need to have risk assessment done early, with identification taking place later. I'd just like to understand, what is the process from now on in terms of using this review to improve our service to students? I'm sure Gifted Association has its own questions, but in terms of the perspective of learning disabilities, where I see that there are some real needs being identified out of this report, I'd just like to understand what is going to be the process that we start to address some of those needs.
Nice segue into my comments. Thank you. So the first two phases of the review had some specific recommendations, which we've been acting upon as staff. This phase hasn't, and that's partly because of the nature of what we focused on, which was really looking at the literature and looking at how the literature jives with the data that was gathered in the first two phases. And the steering committee, we sort of said at the beginning, okay, we don't know where we want to go with this phase. So we kind of asked Alana to dig into one area, and she came back with more information. We said, okay, well, we have questions about this. So it kind of evolved as we went through this phase. And so through that, we didn't really ask her to develop recommendations. And our time was limited in terms of the scope of the year and the funds. So this phase doesn't have recommendations specifically from Alana or from the steering committee. So we as staff are taking these key considerations that have come from this, right? This is certainly the abbreviated version compared to what's in the reports. And we're going to be developing, we've already been talking about, so what are some of the actions that will come from this for us? Because there's certainly some good information here that's really informative. So we'll be coming back to Siak with some actions that we're taking. We'll be looking for some of your input and advice on some of those. Maybe further areas that we're going to dig into, because we haven't allocated any budget specifically towards continuing with an external review. You know, that was part of our decisions as we were facing budget cuts for this year. But there are some areas that we want to dig into more as well to better understand and look at how we can gather better data. So we'll be coming back to you with some next steps from us.
Okay, so on behalf of Siak, Alana, I'd like to thank you for the presentation and thank you for all the work that you've done on this in these three phases. Having been a member of the steering committee, I fully appreciate the wealth of information and data that you had to work with and the level of research you had to do to succinctly summarize for us our findings, what's happening in our board, and where are some opportunities for improvement. And I think, as evidenced by the comments made and the questions made here, we know that there are some areas that we would like to probe and that we will ask Mark and his team to look into and then bring back to Siak for further consideration. So this certainly provided us with a wealth of information that we can now work with, and we thank you for that, and we look forward to continuing that work in this group. Thank you. All right. Okay. All right, so moving on. Next on the agenda is the selection of our new Siak chair. I will take you through the process. Mark will call for indications of interest for the position of chair. Sorry? Oh, okay. Sure. Each member will be given an opportunity to indicate their interest and/or support. The names will be written down by order of who showed interest. Members may speak to their interest, not to exceed 3 minutes, please, in order of names written down on that initial list. Mark will appoint 2 scrutineers and will call the vote by secret ballot. Lorna will hand out the ballots and collect them in the ballot box. Lorna will hand ballot box to scrutineers and they will verify the votes. If only one person shows interest, no vote is necessary. Scrutineers give the name of the winner to Mark on a sheet of paper. And once the chair is elected, the chair follows same process. Okay, this is nope, we're done. Okay. So scrutineers give the name of the selected person to Mark on a sheet of paper, and then that will be announced. All right. So are we ready to begin then? Okay, so I will start in the order here, and I will ask for expression of interest. And you are permitted to speak to your nomination. So starting with Lucille.
I would like to put my name forward as chairman. I have previous experience, having been on the Siak committee previously. Not 3 minutes, but that's all you get.
Christina? Oh, sure.
I don't want to run, but I would like to nominate Deirdre if she's willing.
Okay.
I do not want to run. Thank you. I would not like to run either.
Thank you.
I do not want to run at this moment, but thank you for the nomination, Christina.
I do not want to run, but thank you.
At this time, I think I'm good. Thank you.
No, I'm fine, thank you. I don't want to run.
Okay, Lucille, you may join me.
I would like to ask Deirdre to consider the possibility of being a joint chair between the two of us, or if you do not mind being an alternate as vice, if the vice has to step in.
I can do that. Yeah.
Good. There you go.
I don't know what that really means, but I'm
I'm
open to that.
And we'll have to check with Mark that it's allowed.
I think you might have just made that position up, maybe.
I have.
That's good. Okay, so it's good to know we have a backup. All right. So we have Mark. We have a new chair, Lucille.
We're now moving into the Siak discussion portion of the agenda. Are there any questions?
Yes. Okay, sure.
I'm still looking for my question. Okay, I'll tell you vaguely what my question is. So I had reviewed the budget and a few other documents, and just a few, just all of them. I let them sit through the summer, and then I did my homework. So I missed a couple meetings. So I had a couple of questions, and for some of them, the answer was, we don't have the budget, so we're going to work within those constraints. And for some of them, it was that the staff are going to receive more training. And so my question was, there was a reduction in the budget around professional development, and yet some of the concerns or some of the items actually require more or varied professional development in order to address those issues. So are we just moving it from one hand to another? Or?
Yeah. Great question. So we have less money in the budget for PD, professional development, and yet my response was we need to do more to address some issues. Right. So the need for professional development is basically endless, right? Staff could always benefit from more learning, growth in their skills, etc. So every year there's some professional development that we offer basically every year because we know staff continually need that. We have constant turnover in staff, so we need to be providing for those reasons as well. And we know that some things they only do once a year, so they need, you remember what you need at the time, right? So we know some things you need to get to and redo every year. There are other areas of professional development that we don't offer annually. It's probably more of our professional development because we know our staff are growing and changing themselves and their knowledge and skills, and the needs of our kids change, and what we know about teaching and learning changes, right? It's a growing field. So all of that shapes our decisions about how we spend our money on PD. So as a staff, we're constantly talking about, okay, we see there's more of, the data is telling us we need to more focus more here, for example. In the phase 2 of the review, it's one of the identified areas was that we need to provide more professional development for staff in meeting the needs of gifted kids in a regular classroom. That was one of the recommendations. So I know Sean and his team have been designing that for this year so that we're providing that professional development for primary teachers. So that's an example of how we shift and make those decisions based on lots of factors. The fact that we have less money, it's not great, but we have to make tough decisions all the time, and that's one of the ones we made.
Is there any flexibility in terms, I don't know how the budget works for HTSB, but is there any flexibility in taking funds that were earmarked, say the autism funds, because there was an anticipation that there would be a huge increase in those students, but that might not happen. Is there any flexibility in taking those funds and reallocating them, or?
Yeah, great question. So our budget's about $750 million. I think I'm looking at trustees. And so it sounds like a lot of money. I think about 85% of that is spent on salaries and benefits and utilities, right? So then you have a very small slice of that left for everything else. So, and it may still sound like a lot, hundreds of millions, but you remember we're approaching 110 schools, 65,000 kids. I think we're close to 10,000 staff. We're the biggest employer in the region. So it sounds like a lot of money, but it's not when you spread it all out across all that. So can we move money around? Yes. Depends on where that money is. So for some money is designated in specific areas by the ministry. For example, if they give us money for capital, it's got to stay in capital, right? We can't go and move that elsewhere. They give us envelopes of money for staffing, for example, right? We have to account for the qualifications and experience of every single teacher, for example. And so if teacher X has 10 years experience and this level of qualification and it results in a salary and benefit cost of $75,000, that's exactly what the ministry gives us, right? So they match all that up. So we have to spend those salary allocations in the areas where, if we hire one less teacher, the money goes back, right? It's that kind of thing. So a lot of it is very sweatered or siloed, if you want to call it. But then there are some areas where we do have discretion. So we do make decisions throughout the year. We have to. Think about the size of our organization. We have to make decisions during the year and shift dollars, or if one expense is coming in lower than anticipated, we spend less money on snow plowing, great, we may go and move some of that money over here where we see there's more of a need for roof repair or whatever, right, that kind of thing. So we can make decisions like that. The size of the dollars, if it's a small amount, we're moving 10,000 from here to there. I don't think trustees want to hear about that, and it's nickel and diming. So we do those things. If we're talking about millions, it comes to the board table, and and trustees are hearing about and involved in that. So the money for we set aside $700,000 for potential needs coming in through the changes in the OAP, the Ontario Autism Program. And since in the summer, the Ministry of Children and Community, am I getting this right? The new Ministry of Children and Community Social Services announced another extension of the OAP, right? So now it's going to the end of June. So now we have to decide, what are we doing with that $700,000? So it might sound like, great, Student Services gets $700,000. No, because my colleagues would all say, we put that money aside for a need that you thought you were going to have. It didn't come. So we all have these other needs in all our other departments and schools. Just because your need doesn't show up doesn't mean it's automatically your money, right? So we're talking, actually I have it on a meeting agenda tomorrow to talk about where does that money go. I certainly have my wish list, so we'll see.
We'd like to move on to communication to Siak and to the superintendent's report.
So you've received my report, I think, on Sunday night. I think I sent it. And I'm just making sure I can read it here. A little bigger. So I talked about system startup there. I don't think I'll see much more there. Maps. So at a previous, I think it was Margot that made this request about us creating some maps for you to help you. Mind passing these around? Yes. Helping you become more familiar with our system as a new Siak, and where all of our various programs and classes are. And we say those two words, programs and self-contained classes, because some classes are fit the criteria of a self-contained class as outlined by the ministry. So the ministry has specific criteria that boards have to meet to call it a class for a student with, specifically where all the students in that class have behavior needs, for example, or meet a life skills profile, etc. So where that is the case, where our class fits that criteria, we then call it a self-contained class. But we do have some classes, I'll call them, that don't meet that criteria, so we can't call it self-contained. It doesn't go through the IPRC process because it doesn't fit the bill. But we still want to provide that for those kids, so we call those programs. Understand the difference? Does it maybe look the same? Yeah, but some meet the ministry criteria and some don't. That's why you see the two terms here. So our planning department has created these maps for you, and try to, through their sort of little circles, which are sometimes look like pie graphs, show you where the various types of classes and programs are. I see the learning, that's not even right. Why does it say learning center? That term, I'm sorry, I should have caught that. Because it's not a learning center. We don't have learning centers anymore. That's a Sean, do you have the copy of those? No. I sent them. I'm not saying this is your fault, Sean. Yeah, it didn't say learn, it said lurking center. We don't lurk, just so you know. I'm wondering if that's the structured learning class. That's the.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't know if I'm wrong. I could be. Did they not look at creating the two composite schools in Burlington, so M.M. Robinson and Nelson, so that both of those were going to contain gifted exceptionalities?
So you're talking about when through the band?
So I'm just looking at
through the PAR,
the high schools. So yeah, so through the PAR, I thought, and again, so
yeah,
Nelson and M.M. Robinson were going to be seen as composite schools, so that they were seen as having all the services. But on the map here, Nelson is identified as only gifted. However, I know that the LEAP program started there this year. And M.M. Robinson just has community skills and employability skills. So is that a correct? I don't know. Maybe it's changed since I remember. But
so so yes and no. One, the LEAP program, which is an early entry for kids who were looking to re-engage in school and are going on the applied stream.
Yep.
That's sort of a nutshell of that profile of student. So they go into grade 9 in their grade 8 age. They basically skip grade 8 and go into grade 9 right away. They can do 2 years of grade 9 is sort of what's happening there. That's not a special education program. So you're not seeing.
Right, but again,
so if that's an ask.
No, it's just a question, just because my understanding from the PAR was that we were creating Burlington was creating two composite schools. That's the terminology. So they would each have, not identical, but similar programming fulfillment, so that there was one in the north and one in the south. But from this
not
map,
necessarily the same schools, but that we would offer similar program options in the north and south parts of
but my question is, and you might know the answer to this, were they not looking at having gifted programming in M.M. Robinson as well?
Yes, and it hasn't started yet.
Okay, but
right, these are the maps for this year.
Right, I was just wondering because I knew that was something.
So next year these will look different again. These looked different last year. We added classes this September. I shared with you a list, if you recall, in June. We added classes. We took away classes. We moved classes. That happens every year. That's what we do to meet the needs of our kids in our communities, right? So these maps are for this year. So they're different than what you would have seen last year. And LEAP is a student success program. So our secondary program department runs LEAP. And if you were looking for student success to be included on these maps, then there's a whole another set of our SHISMs, right? Our specialist high school major programs, our alternative program. There's a whole another set of high school things that aren't here. This is specifically special education for this year, right? For gifted in, right. That makes sense? So, I have apologized for this because there are some things here that aren't right. And I saw a first draft from our planning department and I said, can you make these changes to help it read better and be clearer? And I didn't look at them when they came back. So I apologize for that. What's that? Yes, we don't have any lurking centers. Yes.
So Mark, once the corrections are made,
Are you thinking of sharing this on the website with the parent community, or?
To be honest, we made them for you because you asked for them. So we hadn't thought about going more broadly. We could think about putting them into, it could be part of the working together document, right, to help parents see where things are. So maybe we could, we'll have to think more about that. But I think, so there are challenges with that. So can I suggest, and I apologize for this, can I take these back so that you don't have the inaccurate ones? And then we'll send you, because I should have caught these.
Sorry, Mark.
Some of these aren't accurate.
I just want to add, funny that this came very timely because I just had a family that they're new in the area and they were asking me, can you tell us where the self-contained programs are? And I was just on the website today at work and I looked every corner of the website and there is no way for a family to find out what school has a self-contained or any sort of special education programming. I looked at maps, boundaries, and there's only really two options to search, English or French.
So
there's no special education program search.
So if you could pass these back to Lorna. I apologize for that. So let's do that. I know. I just want to make sure that what's out there is accurate, right? If I could respond to what Sophia said, and it's a caution, because
I'm just going to look at it.
the challenge is that in the end, we don't give parents a choice, right? And it's because we can't. So if we said to you, there are 10 locations, I don't know how many, let's say 5 locations of learning disabilities classes in Burlington, which one do you want to go to? They all have limits set by the ministry, right? Each exceptionality has different limits, 6, 8, 10, 12, it depends. And so you say, well, I want to go to the one that, this one here. Oh, and there's a space.
Isn't it whatever's geographically closer to where you live?
So we look at, so the needs come in. So, every month schools hold school resource team meetings, SRTs. Students come forward, the discussions, all this things go on, and recommendations and decisions. So you would have to get to a point where you say, we're considering a self-contained class for this student. Obviously, parents are part of that decision or that discussion. If that's an SRT recommendation, it then comes into our department where our staff say, okay, here's a student looking for an LD placement in Burlington. What are the options, right? And they certainly say, what's their home school? Where do they live? Parents can express on the self-contained request form. I don't know if I'm getting the right language here, Sean. Parents can say on that form, if they have a preference for proximity to home. This is on the self-contained request form. Proximity to home, if gender numbers or balance matters in the class. I'm trying to think what else is on there. They can do some free text of things that are important to them. So that goes on the parents indicate that. And then the staff go and look at that and the profile of the student and go and say, okay, so there's a spot at that school and this one. The other 3 are full. It's not an option. So now we have, if the class that's in their home school is full, we're not going to say to your child, oh, you live a school over, your child's now out because someone in that school wants in. We don't do that. We say whoever's there, they get to stay. If someone in that class is requesting to be closer to home, we'll look at that when the options come open, but we won't bump kids. So, yeah. So if there's a, if it's full, we can't exceed the number because that's the ministry regulation. So then we look at what other options there are. Yeah. So if you could see the complexity of parents, and then there's so then we might, especially in the spring, we'll have I don't know how many kids come new into self-contained in the spring, Sean, 100? Lots, right? Dozens and dozens, if not over 100 new kids, because we have kids graduating out, right? So we have all these new kids coming in. So imagine, well, then what is it? First come, first serve? Parents get to pick? We don't do that. So we bring all those requests in, look at all the options, and say, okay, so these 3 kids make sense to go here. We look at that. There are also differences in the class makeup. So for example, if there's 5 boys in that behavior class, do you want your one girl, your one daughter to go in that class as well? Probably not. Sometimes that's okay, but probably not. Sometimes we have dynamics in terms of the profile of those kids where we know this child here will not be a good fit in terms of those other dynamics, right? And those are only things that staff would know, parents wouldn't. So this is all to go back to say, I can understand why parents might want to know where all the classes, but I don't want to get their hopes up for them to think, oh, because I get to pick, because you don't. That's not how our process works.
I think, though, maybe there should be some sort of happy medium, because I feel like, as a parent that's looking to move in, you want to be close to a school that has a program, like to not have that information, or for it to be that difficult. Like, we're getting this copy now, because we're on Siak, and it was specifically requested,
But there may not be an opening for years in that class.
Yeah. So what happens in, this family in particular, so they're moving into that area, that school's at capacity,
right?
So their child who needs that self-contained program.
So we have... We don't turn kids down. If the SRT is recommending that placement, we don't turn that down. So we find a placement where there is one. We have opened classes mid-year. If we've really been pressed, and we say there's anywhere, for another LD kid, we'll go and open a class. So we don't turn kids down. Sometimes the class we have to offer, parents say no. Because they say, okay, it's going to be a half-an-hour bus ride. I don't want my 7-year-old on the bus for that long. I'm telling you, different choices for different families. So
would that child then be, okay, we're going to put them into a mainstream classroom?
So then we say, okay, so what are all the, and sometimes we end up putting more resources into a class than we might normally because that child is staying put. We make those decisions to meet the needs of kids. Yeah.
So you're saying in the near future, are we looking to put something like this on the website for parents?
I'm hesitant about that for all the reasons I'm saying. This, like I said, we really made this for you guys because you asked. So, but the intent was not. I think if we're going to say, oh, let's go and put this out there for parents, I think that requires a deeper discussion. Because what are we doing in terms of creating expectations and when the system we have in place, we do it this way because we've given us lots of thought and consideration about how can we best meet the needs of all kids. Doesn't mean everyone gets their first choice. We have a whole system to think of, and how do we do that as best we can. So I think Heather wanted to say something.
I think it's important that everyone understand, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, that parents can't just turn down opportunities to go into a self-contained class because it doesn't meet their criteria of being so close to the school, and that they hope that their child would be put into a classroom in their home school with additional services, i.e. a one-to-one EA or something like that. That's not always the case either. You can't just turn down a placement just to, oh, my student or my child will get an EA one-to-one. That doesn't necessarily work either, right?
I'll say it's a pretty complex conversation, right? If everyone agrees that the self-contained placement is the best choice for that child, then we really get into some nitty-gritties about, okay, so what's that kind of look like? And if parents are hesitant about a certain class or location, there's lots we do to help them understand the class, go and visit, look at how long the bus ride will be, who their peers might be. Like there's a lot that goes into, and then looking at how the child, if the parent says, oh, I don't want that, okay, so let's talk a lot about what's it looking like in the regular class, right? And we do have in some cases families that just say, absolutely not. It doesn't even matter if it's in their home school. Still saying no. And so we continue to work to meet their needs in a regular class. But there's limits to that, right? If you're a child with an exceptionality who's, potentially not participating much or at all in the regular class because there's such a gap in their profile of what they can do and with what the rest of the class is doing. And in essence, they're sitting at the back of the class with an EA or maybe in another part, room in the school, and that's how they get their programming and learning. At what point are they no longer a part of that class, right? Because the gap for some profiles of kids does grow, right? If their cognitive ability is that limited, it grows over time, and it's unfortunate that there's only so much we can do in a regular class. We meet the needs of thousands of kids with special needs in the regular class. Let's be clear on that. There's a small group for whom that's really difficult, and that's why the ministry has self-contained classes as an option for boards. And so for a small number of kids, that's the right placement.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify just to comment what you were saying. I don't think a parent would ever say, oh, yes, my child can get that EA. Like, obviously, they would do what's best for them, but we know that we always try our best to make the home school help the child be sort of included and have equity and inclusion as much as we can in their home school. So I think ideally, like if a child's going to be bused, like Mark was saying, a half an hour, and their home school's right there, then in that case, I think the board should try create some inclusion in the classroom.
And I know the board does. I know that the board does their absolute best and to meet the needs of the child, but it is very complex.
So I apologize. We will make sure these are right and get them back out to you. Okay? I included number 3 in my update. You might have said, Mark, didn't I already read this? Yeah, this is the same language I put to you in the email from the previous week. But I thought this was important. There's some good questions here, and it was important to include in the minutes. So, because my report gets put into the minutes, right? So that's why I included number 3 there, but you've already seen that. And number 4, because I'm assuming that you've all seen the news and know that the OAP has been extended. But once again, I thought that was important to be in the minutes as well, for families to see that. Any questions about my report? I know James has got to get going.
Okay. Do any of the associations have reports to share?
I'd just like to invite everybody. We are having our first ever corporate breakfast. We have recently taken over the geography of Hamilton as well, so we're now Halton Hamilton. So we serve a general population of 1.5 million people, and about 125,000 of those will have learning disabilities. As one of our fundraising events, we're having a corporate breakfast on October the 1st. We have Rick Green, the comedian from The Red Creek Show, and an ADHD advocate coming to speak. So we would welcome you all to come to our event. If you would like, tickets are only $25 for other community groups. It's full breakfast, silent auction, networking, and it should be a great event. So thank you. Please join us if you can.
Free duct tape at the door? Or,
Any other questions? Any other reports to share?
Sorry, Allison, that information is shared on your website. Can you just remind us?
Yes, you can purchase tickets on the ldhh.ca siak.ca website. Mark, your invitation is coming, so you have one coming. But we would welcome, I say, and please pass it out to as many people. It'll be a great event. Rick Green will be talking about his lived experience with ADHD, and I'm sure it'll be enlightening, insightful, but also very, very funny. So please come and join us.
Trustee reports.
Okay, I will start and then pass it over to Margot. Back in 2015, trustees, director, and the senior administration embarked on developing a multi-year plan. And that led to engagement with stakeholders and staff, obviously, and the Student Senate. And as a result, we were able to develop a new vision and values that you see posted here. And that was for the time period of 2016-2020. So it is time to once again start that process and review our vision and values. And there were some lessons learned in the first go around because majority of the trustees are returning. So this will be our second involvement in the process. So some great lessons learned, and so we are looking at a broader stakeholder engagement, broader reach out to the parent community, the student community, and all the educational partners. And obviously Siak is a key partner in that, so there will be an opportunity for Siak's involvement as well. The steering committee had its first meeting last week. Trustees, director, and the superintendents will be meeting the end of the month to do some big visioning in order to seek out some data from all our partners, and then that will lead into the work of the multi-year plan. And that will be for 2020, 24, 21, 25, something like that. All right, over to Margot.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of updates. We had our first board meeting of the year 2 weeks ago, and we inducted our 2 new student trustees, Olivia Lau, who's from White Oaks, and Matthew Burns, who's from Oakville, Trafalgar, so welcome them to the team. Really the big update that we have for you is that the second phase of funding was released for the updates on Nelson, so that was sort of a big sigh of relief for us 2 weeks ago. Jane McKenna came to visit the site last Friday and had a tour of the building just to see where the renovations are taking place. Parent council meetings for Robert Bateman and Nelson will be coming up in the next couple of weeks, and then the integration meetings will begin. The dates of the integration committee are, the first one will be on October the 22nd, and I think, Lou, you are the rep from Siak for the integration. I know we did this way back when, and there was no integration committee.
I think we didn't have a...
No, it was. I'm sure it was Lou. Because I remember her asking me. That's why I'm saying it. So I'm not rough.
Yeah, it might have been picked that she was...
Nelson Robert Bateman High School Integration, Lucille. So you signed it. So I knew. So because we signed up for subcommittees. And you kept saying, when is the first one? And they hadn't started yet. So the first date is October the 22nd.
There we go. Now we know.
And then one other point of interest that might be out there is last week at the Committee of the Whole, Mayor Mead Ward from Burlington came to speak to the trustees about looking at the opportunity to partner with the City of Burlington in providing free transit for school buses for students. That is then going towards the board. I think tomorrow we're going to talk about it, but that's a really exciting opportunity to be keeping your eye on. So thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm moving on to the committees, and the first one is the big committee. Anything to report?
There's a conference, the Parent Involvement Committee Conference, great annual event with both staff and external speakers and experts in various fields. And the date of that is October 19. So please do share that with your parent community. And it's at Garth Webb. So it's a Saturday morning event. It starts fairly early. And is it all day? Till mid-afternoon. Yeah. And there will be free child minding provided. So please share that with your parent community and really impress upon them what a great opportunity this is, because parents do get to select the different workshops they're interested in based on their interest. So it can be pretty specialized. Thank you.
Would it be helpful to send you a link to on the board webpage to show you what that is? So Lauren, if you could do that. It usually goes out through the school council, because that's sort of not the only intended audience. It tends to be a lot of the audience, but it's open to any parent. So yeah, it should be shared with the parent community, because that's who it's for.
And registration is open now.
Yeah, it is. So, yeah.
And it's a free event. They just need to have a sense of numbers for planning purposes.
Yeah. So maybe we'll send that out in a separate email, so you don't have to wait for the minutes. So, okay.
The Accessibility Committee, Coordinating Committee.
That would be me, and
probably haven't met yet, have they?
They have not met yet this year, so I'm waiting for the dates. Thank you.
The Special Education Review.
I think we've heard enough for tonight. Yeah. And you have to say that specifically.
Yeah.
But the review has, our work with the outcomes haven't ended, but the review itself has ended. So it could come off the reporting.
Okay.
Because it's no longer a committee.
And then the Nelson Robert Bateman, which we've done.
Yeah. Oh, well, equity though.
Oh, equity.
Yeah. It's
Oh,
the Spec
sorry.
Ed one that comes off.
Yeah, Spec Ed one comes off. Okay. So the equity.
Quickly, I don't know if that's where it comes, but there is the Human Rights Symposium that's coming up in December. Keep your eye open for that. I think it's December the 4th.
Yeah, it's the first week. It's early December, and the focus is on the rights of the child through the lens of the United Nations Charter of Children's Rights.
December
so the planning
the 5th.
is underway. December 5th. So the planning is underway for that.
Yeah. I just typed in human rights in the board website, and up comes that's the first thing that comes up is the symposium on December the 5th. So we can include that link as well when Lorna sends out the other. Stephen Lewis, he's the keynote speaker. So.
Okay. Our next agenda order paper.
So I'll say right now on the next agenda, we have a request. If you remember, we had this request twice in the spring, and it kept getting put off because they weren't ready. You shouldn't say it like that. Because it had to be withdrawn, was a request from our Safe Schools department, I guess, on a revised code of conduct for our students. The ministry, it has to be revised regularly, but it includes expectations wherever they might come from. So one of them, for example, is the ministry's expectation around students' use of cell phones. The ministry has said all boards must have this in place in a number of ways within their system, and so that includes in our student code of conduct. So that gets revised with some regularity, and so our Safe Schools folks have done that and want to hear Siak's input. So you bring in the lens of students with special needs to look at that. So we've had a request to be on the October agenda for that to be shared here. So that will be on the agenda for sure. And then I know we have some other ideas, but I guess this is on the agenda now to ask you if you have ideas for October, but also for other future agendas of topics that you'd like to see us explore here.
There were some questions that came up as a result of the exercise we did around mental health, where we as a group had input, and then there were some questions that came back to us that I don't know if we need to respond to. And then there were some suggestions made that we look at further down the road. So I can email those if you want.
So if you recall, Michelle Bates, our mental health lead, came and presented to you about our mental health strategy and activities. And so I've shared with her your questions, and we have a revised mental health strategy with new initiatives happening for this year that she would be able to come and share with you and get more input on. So certainly, I'm not sure if we're always, when we work together to design the agenda, we always look at how much can we fit, right? Because there's so many things. So, but for sure, that's on our list.
Yeah, just to come back, you mentioned today, Mark, about updating us on some of these early intervention tools and strategies that are already being done in the classroom. I'd love to hear a bit more about, what's going on and how we can identify children at risk of a number of different exceptionalities.
Well, to follow up, I know I had brought this up a couple times, and Lisa had asked in June about the assistive tech camps. So I know it was offered, but it was so minimal, I think only 10 kids. Honestly, I had been asking you all year, and I didn't even hear about it. And Lisa said she actually had to contact the company directly to find out if the camp was even being run, who was run. So schools are not, what's the process? That information was not relayed to me, and I had asked so many times about it. And I found that so disappointing. And then, of course, all the families that I represent, they were like, what happened to this camp? You said it was going to be inclusive this year, and we would hear about it, but even CERTs didn't know. It was it's so mysterious. I don't know why there's so much, it's so ambiguous trying to get answers around that.
We can certainly share back, because I just read a report shared by staff of all the fabulous things that happened in.
Well, I
those
keep
camps
hearing
this summer.
year
So,
after
yeah,
year how
so-
fabulous it is, but
so-
I've been wanting to enroll my son, and I know there's so many other families
Yeah.
that are interested, but it's this mystery camp.
So-
No one
so-
knows when it is or where it is.
So I might suggest a broader, include that, but to have a broader presentation and discussion about assistive technology.
Well, I think so. I just think a lot of our
it's-
kids who have the tools are given all the Siak claimed equipment.
Yeah.
Not a lot of training around how to use it, and then just generally camp options for our kids with special needs.
Yeah.
There aren't any. This is the only one, and it's not shared. Even the CERT was as soon as I hear about it, I'm going to let you know. And
Yeah.
a couple other families in school, and she's like, I didn't hear. I don't know if it nobody knows.
Yeah.
It was
So how about
very last minute.
let's add that to our list of possibilities, because there's a lot of fabulous things happening, and
But, I just
if
find
there's not great communication, then we need to hear and
Well,
improve
yeah.
that.
Considering all
And-
year, I had if you look at our agenda or
Yep.
minutes, I had asked about this
I hear
3 or
you.
4 times.
Yep.
And
Because there's lots of learning that goes on through the year. I think when you hear that, we have thousands of devices out there for kids with special needs being used in many, many ways. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean we can't get better at it.
yeah,
But I think to have an informed discussion, you need to hear first what is happening,
absolutely.
and
yeah.
then help us with how we can get better at it.
But just to
so-
clarify, the camp, is that run by the company itself or with the board, or who actually runs the camp?
So, is this for a future discussion or right now?
Just a quick, a nutshell.
Yeah.
Together?
So Sean, where did we go with this year? So it's a joint
Joint, okay.
staff, external provider
No,
together.
I've heard great things, but just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we'll add assistive technology to the list. Others?
In the past, we've been talking about making parents aware of Siak. And I know we threw a few ideas together. I know I had suggested, at a barbecue that the school has or an open house or whatever, that we have something that we could provide parents with. And I don't know where that kind of went from there.
Yeah. Okay, let's add that to the list.
Just for future topics, I'd love to hear about, and it may be part of the code of conduct, around bullying and some of the other issues that some of the schools are facing around racism and homophobic behaviors and things along those lines. Just how we're measuring the metrics of the programmings that we're doing to find if bullying, if that's working and if it's effective. And also throughout the year, I've seen both on TV and in print issues about the violence in schools being on the increase and concerns by staff, et cetera, and especially with the population that we're dealing with. I'm just wondering if that's part of the code of conduct or if we can have a discussion around that and what's being done to address that concern.
Great suggestions as well. How many meetings do we have this year? Okay.
And then for me, there's, I don't know if this is an agenda item or an email, but there's some budget-related items that just needed more digging with. I think you said the business unit, maybe, to answer those, so they're captured somewhere, yes.
Okay, thank.
Yeah, and those may just be answers that I respond directly to you, or could be more broad. Yeah.
Thanks for all the suggestions. And now I'm calling for a motion to adjourn. We just adjourned. We just said.
The agenda's over. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.